welcome to today's episode of TheSquare. We're going to be talking about the Curiosity Report 2021, and I am really excited to be joined by Samantha Flores, director of Hugo, and Tania White, design researcher with Hugo, to talk a little bit about what this new report holds. Thank you guys for being here.
Yeah, we're so excited.
So tell me a little bit about, it's been a year since we did the Curiosity Report, the first one. What have we learned over the last year? What are things that kind of stand out to you over the last year?
We learned a lot over the last year. I mean, one of the biggest things we learned is it doesn't really take a generation for transition or revolution anymore. Yeah. It takes a couple of days or a couple of months. And so you really can't hold on to any ideas or any, technologies or any behaviors too long, because they're going to change really quickly.
About the time you would start probably writing an article on something and get it ready to be published, it had already evolved into something new.
Right.
Yeah.
So is there any technology you felt like this surprised you, maybe overperforming or underperforming?
We talked a lot about collaborative design tools or collaborative virtual digital hybrid spaces in the first Curiosity Report, a lot about AR and VR. And man, I feel like that's been so helpful during this time. Collaborating and getting together, connecting together with people has just been so incredible. I think all of those tools have moved forward quite a bit, obviously.
So, the Curiosity Report it wasn't released until last March, which is kind of when everything happened with COVID. But so much of the research that was going into it was pre-COVID. So I would imagine there's a lot of things that I've heard you say specifically, Sam, that COVID was a catalyst for a lot of technologies, not necessarily something that introduced a bunch of new technologies. So how has that change happened over the last year?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen a lot of things accelerate, not only technologies, but human behaviors. I mean, we talked a lot about user adoption and how it's imperative that you understand your user adoption when you're talking about emerging technologies or how the users are going to use it or, at what rate that they're going to start using it at. But we saw a lot of different technologies just accelerate significantly because users were adopting it over this time in order to stay connected or to stay safe, stay socially distanced.
Yeah. I think one thing that's really interesting, let's see, in last year we daylighted artificial intelligence as a suite of technologies that are infiltrating our world. But an AI was actually the first to find COVID in Wuhan about 10 days before the World Health Organization.
Really?
Yeah, announced it to the world. And we just think now, we've become so much more comfortable with technology. If COVID hit now, would we have listened to something like an AI? That company is called Blue Dot, and they basically build algorithms to track diseases.
Well, I think that's a good transition to, I know the theme of Curiosity Report 2021 is perspectives, and one of the things that's right up front is bias. And I had no idea there were so many different kinds of bias. I'm familiar with unintentional bias and a few others, but there were a ton.
And the ones we listed are just a sample of the types, but we talked about things like confirmation bias. So you're more likely to turn towards supporting evidence that supports your own viewpoint or kind of worldview.
It's too bad we didn't see that in any way exemplified the last year.
Yeah, of course. There's actually a fantastic news source that we came across called Ground News that basically tells you more about the echo chamber that you live in when it comes to how you consume news. So it will feature a news headline, and then it will tell you what news platforms it was featured on.
Yes,
and
I
if
saw
they
that.
leaned left or right, it will tell you, hey, if you tend to lean liberal, this story is a blind spot for you because they're not covering it. And that was developed by, I believe, a NASA engineer, and she just saw an opportunity and developed this platform. But yeah, there's tons of bias, and it's usually self-serving. It's usually your brain going, I'm just trying to confirm my own everything. And
it's rarely trying to look at it from someone else's point of view.
No, it's not. It's really a survival mechanism.
So that might kind of lead right in, but I'm curious, why is it so crucial that we understand our biases?
Well, when you think about being an expert in any field, there's a point where you become so expert in your field that you kind of know everything there is to know, and you stop trying to innovate outside of your bubble, or you think, well, these are the problems I'm going to come up against. These are the roadblocks. So I'm just going to avoid those and move around them and answer the question the way that I might have always done it. And that's the problem, is the business as usual, or this is the way that we've always done it. So when you start to look outside and start to gain other perspectives, you start to understand where that unintentional bias is. And that means asking people in different communities about their use of the spaces that you design or the technology that you design. There's a lot of unintentional bias built into technology that we're just now uncovering because we're realizing these data gaps exist.
You in a different conversations, you gave me an example of that with VR.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. This was a rabbit hole I went down, but it was just so interesting that, so male and female retinas are extremely different from each other.
Right.
We have more hormones on our retinas than any other part of our body except for one.
Yeah, gotcha.
And the weird thing is that, so male retinas are thicker.
Right.
So they actually see virtual reality through motion parallax. And then women's retinas actually, they change blood levels really easily, and so we perceive virtual reality through shape-form shading. And so because of that, VR is actually, a lot of the goggles are designed for the male retinas.
Eyes. I gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
and also the interpupillary distances
Yeah.
are for men.
Yeah.
And so that's why women get motion sickness a lot easier in VR than men. And when we're creating digital tools like that and using them as a part of our design process,
Right.
it's automatically creating a certain bias towards, one or the other. And it's even worse for the transsexual community.
So one of the other themes that I saw throughout the Curiosity Report was the theme of decentralization and democratization. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, with decentralization, obviously that's taking, specific entities and redistributing them at smaller frequencies, mesh networks, things like that. But when we think about democratization, that's really giving access to a lot of people. So when we're talking about decentralization and democratization, we can think about that through food networks, taking, agricultural landscapes and redistributing them into our urban areas that have food deserts, for instance, in smaller pockets, so that people have access to quality food at lower cost because it doesn't take that long to transport to them. And that's a great example of, democratizing that access.
So just out of curiosity, just in the last week, we had the huge snowstorm that hit Texas.
I was going to bring that up.
Is that something where with the power grid that would be an applied technology?
Yeah. So another kind of learn from last year's report was one of the technologies was distributed ledger technology,
Right.
which also taps into this larger theme of things becoming more distributed and bypassing that third party. Usually by doing that, you reduce like a cost or you gain some sort of efficiency, and microgrids are a form of that. So when you are a solar power producer at your residence, you are what's called a prosumer, a producer and a consumer.
Got it.
And a microgrid is basically a bunch of prosumers coming together and saying, well, we don't need to sell our energy back to the grid at, quite a fee.
Yeah.
We can just administer that amongst ourselves and create what's called a microgrid. Not that that's the future for Texas, or we don't know what that recommendation is, but it's a trend that you're seeing, and is very relevant to architecture, that if these large typologies that we build can create and produce and hold their own energy, that becomes a very different system.
So I want to pick your brain a little bit on a couple of the specific articles that were in the Curiosity Report. So in Tyranny of Screens, you mentioned that for hundreds of years, we've really allowed technology to kind of dictate the design of spaces, particularly in the recent history with screens and in the layout. Give me some examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, the radio was really the first technology, or the first one that we talk about, that kind of dictates the way that you interact with space.
Right.
Because once radio came to the home, people would set it up in their living room and they would all sit around that radio to listen to the news. And then when it became TV, people would watch the TV. So they create this, forward facing
Yeah.
type of interaction. And what happens is that screen starts to dictate the way we lay out our space. So that technology is really dictating our interior design. And so you can think about it whenever you're setting up your home. You think, where am I going to put the couch, because it needs to be facing the TV.
Yeah, absolutely.
But once we start to dematerialize those screens and start to use AI and use other different types of technologies and move those into our day-to-day systems, we no longer need a physical space for a screen, and we can recreate those storytelling conversations in a more natural position.
Yeah, and I think you see it at the home, but you then see it in the school, in the classroom, right? Where the chalkboard was that center focal piece. And now they were like, well, we'll just put the screen there because that's where the chalkboard used to be. You see it in the office.
Or the digital whiteboard.
Yeah, the digital whiteboard,
Yeah.
whatever. You see it in the office. That's where I've personally felt it the most, is this friction of when I'm in the office, but I have a phone call with a client and I'm in another room, in that room with maybe a teammate, and if I go to walk up to start writing something on a whiteboard, all of a sudden I've left the purview of the screen and now the client can't see me. And I'm like, okay, I'm trying to interact with so many different mediums. It's very, tyrannical.
But I mean, then, okay, how do you break out of the status quo? Because, I think it has had that influence for a reason, right? So how do we break away from that? Or can we break away from that? Or is that something technology, as it advances and we use AR and whatnot, that is decentralized from its normal place in the room? Does that change how we lay out rooms?
So I think that there are a lot of different social structures that are already built into our space that enable the design of the space. The screen really takes you out of conversation, out of natural conversation. So that's what we were looking at, is how do we dematerialize that screen and bring the conversation back to this, this natural circle. And there are a lot of different technologies that are helping or that are moving in that direction. Certainly, little meeting robots like Temi or Meeting Owl, things like that are helping to move the conversation back into the circle and actually move that digital person or the hybrid person that's calling in back into the conversation. Because what we've realized is that sometimes if you're calling into a conference room and everybody's there in person, you're the one that can't get your voice through because it's unnatural for people to look up, just like you were saying.
Some of our teammates have also shared some research around like social accountability when robots are in the room. So if I'm maybe more introverted and don't voluntarily participate in conversation as much, they've done studies where if there is a workplace assisted robot video camera thing in the middle, that it actually you might be like, ooh, someone's watching, basically. So I'm going to make sure I make space for the person, because an introvert, doesn't necessarily not have things to say. They're just not saying them.
We were just doing a virtual furniture demo in California last week, and that was one of the things that we're always trying to evolve our practice, and that was one of the things we had talked about, is if we'd had a big screen that was representative and had the people that were coming in virtually to be able to interact with the people that were in the room, it would give that space and that weight and that presence to the people that have a virtual presence. So it's interesting to hear you say that.
One thing about the robots is that pulls the person who's calling in into the circle of the conversation.
In a physical way.
Right. What's the other challenge with the tyranny of the screen is that even if you have that, at this point, we're still presenting to the screen, right?
Yeah.
We're still doing our slide decks on the screen. And what we need for technology to do, and it is advancing at this point, is bringing that into the circle as well. So, we're seeing advances in haptic holograms that are created with ultrasound so that when you touch...
Sorry to interrupt. Explain a little bit what a haptic hologram is.
Yeah, so when you... so basically, it's light projected onto a moving dust particle. And when you actually project that light, it's also emitting ultrasound ultrasound that you can't hear. Maybe your dog can, so probably don't use that at home. But because of the ultrasound, when you touch that haptic hologram, even though it's just light, you're feeling something. And so what we've seen with the University of Sussex and the research that they're doing there with haptic holograms, they're actually able to call in their virtual participants and have them sitting in a chair next to you. Right now it's really grainy, but they're still working on it. And I think that will also be the next step in dematerializing that screen and democratizing access to conversation, because when you are on the screen and everybody else is around the table,
absolutely,
you have some sort of left
There's
out
a
of
barrier.
this.
Yeah, absolutely. Last but not least, because I like to geek out about space, the Mars task analysis, which I think there's some really interesting things that I'd love for you to touch on. But I kept thinking about this question, which is why Mars versus the moon? Like, I get that Mars is way more difficult, so it's more of a challenge. But it feels like so much with what you hear about is about how we're going to get to Mars when we still haven't, established any kind of a colony or anything on the moon.
Well, we can both tackle this one because we love Mars and anything space related. I would say the moon is essentially being viewed as the pit stop.
Got it.
And then the long game is kind of Mars and interstellar travel. If you listen to things that Elon Musk has said, or even I believe his name is pronounced Michio Kaku, he's a physicist at Harvard. Mm-hmm. One of the kind of rationales for going to Mars is you reduce our rate of extinction if you have 2 colony outposts. So the likelihood of Earth getting hit by an asteroid or having some sort of catastrophic event is quite high.
Yeah.
But when you duplicate it on another planet, all of a sudden it just sinks dramatically.
Right.
We'll say that we are also looking at, yes, Mars and the moon are all fun, but we also have a planet on Earth that we really need to. We don't want to repeat the same mistakes that maybe we're.
You're not just trashing it and moving to a new one.
Next. And then in terms of the Mars task analysis, well, we spoke with an anthropologist who has been contracted through NASA for years. He's run some of the longest standing human behavior studies on astronauts, because those are really the only people who've gone into space. Yeah. And he was recently recruited by NASA to examine Mars. So there are these very sexy images of the colony on Mars, and we're there, but
cool
there's a lot
suit.
in between from literally when it lands and you have to get out. Yeah. And you've atrophied and you need robotic assistance, and you never see those images, which is why we had fun with the image you see in the report, which is it's like, we're here and we're standing. And it's like, it's probably not going to look like that.
It's what we all think. That's the ideal, but it's probably not. And, we are always fascinated with Mars, and it, perseverance just happens. So that's really exciting. But we do know that there are other steps to space colonization or space travel or even space tourism. Space jumps have had their heyday, and they're really, fun. Or they look fun. I don't know. They kind of look scary.
She was there last week.
I was there last week. But we're also, tracking some companies like Space Perspective that are taking tourists up in a completely different way. And we are looking at the, how the parallels between the demographic that is, going camping right now and camping under the stars versus, going up in Space Perspective and camping within the stars. Yeah. And it's really interesting. And we are even looking at, what it might be like to have, our spaceports cater to that type of tourism, and what it even might be like to see, the gastronomy experience as you're, kind of floating over different countries. How can we kind of bring food or aerosolize those taste buds?
All right, so tell me what's next for Curiosity Report, like moving forward. I know you just got this one done. Like, you want to take a deep breath. No, but I mean, one of the things that you mentioned was technologies move so quickly that I'm sure there's some challenges to doing a report that's once a year.
Right. Well, I mean, the whole purpose of the Curiosity Report is to kind of share, educate, and really get some ideas together for conversation. And, sharing it in an annual is really great until technology and information starts moving at day to day,
Yeah.
hour to hour, minute to minute pace.
Yeah.
And so, you know, something we are looking at is how can we start to kind of voice our opinions and curiosities a little bit more frequently throughout the year instead of, you know, one single annual report. We still, you know, will have an annual, but we also, you know, are looking at other ways to kind of introduce that information, because we also know that everyone is getting way more familiar with digital technologies
for sure.
and how they want to take on their content. So we're looking into a lot of different avenues.
Side note, I love how you guys have done it online, where it's like the page animation and it feels like
Shout
I'm
out to
actually-
Chelsea.
Yeah. It feels like I'm actually reading through a book. It makes it awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us and kind of shedding a little bit of light. If you want to check out the Curiosity Report 2021, make sure you check out the links below. Also, as with all Square and Curious Conversation episodes this year, you're actually viewing a truncated view of the conversation. We have the full unedited conversation that's available on an audio podcast. So make sure to check that out. And thank you for joining us.